The first time Ethan kissed a boy, the world didn't end, but his family did. At 17, in the cramped kitchen of their Tacoma home, he'd stammered the truth to his parents, his heart pounding like a war drum. By the next morning, his parents' marriage was a casualty, and Ethan was left navigating two homes, two sets of expectations, and a self he barely recognized. Ethan Carter, barely 19, stood at the edge of Gasworks Park in Seattle, the rusted industrial relics looming like ghosts of a life he couldn't quite grasp. The late September air carried the bite of autumn, and the Space Needle pierced the horizon, a distant reminder of a city that felt both too big and too small for him. He clutched his sketchbook, its pages filled with half-finished drawings of faces he'd never dare show anyone, especially not his parents. His mother, Diane, had moved to a sleek condo in Capitol Hill, where she filled the silence with NPR podcasts and forced smiles, pretending Ethan's coming out was just a phase she could love him through. His father, Greg, had retreated to a sagging ranch house in Puyallup, where he drank too much and spoke too little, his disappointment a heavy fog between them. Ethan shuttled between them, a ghost in both homes, wearing masks to keep the peace. With his mom, he was the sensitive artist, nodding along to her progressive platitudes. With his dad, he was the stoic son, swallowing his truth to avoid another argument. Neither version felt like him. Today, though, was different. Ethan had agreed to meet someone new, someone he'd connected with on a local art forum online. Julian Torres, a 20-year-old photography student at the University of Washington, had messaged him about a sketch Ethan posted. A faceless figure curled under a street lamp, shadows swallowing its edges. "It feels like you're hiding something," Julian had written. "I want to know what." Ethan spotted him across the park, leaning against a tree with a camera slung around his neck. Julian was shorter than Ethan expected, with sharp cheekbones and dark hair that fell into his eyes. He wore a faded denim jacket, patched with pins from local bands, and his smile was warm but guarded, like he'd learned to expect the worst from people. Ethan's stomach twisted, not just from nerves but from the strange pull of recognition, like Julian might see the parts of him he'd buried. "Hey, you're Ethan, right?" Julian's voice was soft, with a faint trace of an accent Ethan couldn't place. Maybe Puerto Rican, maybe Mexican, Ethan didn't ask. He just nodded, clutching his sketchbook tighter. "Yeah, you're Julian." Ethan's voice cracked, betraying the confidence he'd rehearsed in his head. Julian grinned, pushing off the tree. "In the flesh. You gonna show me that sketchbook? Or is it top secret?" Ethan hesitated, his fingers tracing the worn cover. "It's not great. Just doodles. Doodles that got me out here on a Saturday," Julian said, raising an eyebrow. "Come on, let's walk." They wandered toward the lake, the city's hum fading into the rustle of leaves and the distant call of gulls. Julian talked easily about his photography, his love for capturing fleeting moments, the way light could tell a story. Ethan listened, stealing glances at Julian's hands, the way they moved with purpose, like they could coax truth from anything they touched. For the first time in months, Ethan felt the knot in his chest loosen, just a little. They ended up on a bench overlooking Lake Union, the sunset painting the water in hues of amber and pink. Julian set his camera down and turned to Ethan, his eyes searching. "So, what's the deal with that sketch? The one with the guy under the street lamp?" It felt heavy. Ethan's throat tightened. He'd drawn it after a fight with his dad, when Greg had slurred something about fixing him. The figure was Ethan or some version of him, lost, unseen. "It's just how I feel sometimes," he said finally. "Like I'm stuck in the dark, and no one's looking." Julian didn't push, didn't offer empty platitudes. He just nodded, his gaze steady. I get that. My family's not exactly thrilled about me either. My dad thinks photography's a waste, and my mom prays for my soul every Sunday. But you keep going, you know? You find people who see you. Ethan's heart stuttered. He wanted to ask what Julian meant, if people could mean him, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he opened his sketchbook, flipping to a drawing of a boy with fragmented features. Half a smile, half a shadow. Julian leaned closer, his shoulder brushing Ethan's, and for a moment, the world felt small and safe. Damn, Julian whispered. That's raw. You're good, Ethan. Ethan's cheeks burned, but before he could respond, his phone buzzed. A text from his mom. Dinner at 7. Don't be late. The weight of his split life crashed back in, and he shoved the phone into his pocket. Julian noticed. You okay? Yeah. Ethan lied, the mask slipping back into place. Just family stuff. Julian didn't push, but his hand lingered near Ethan's on the bench, close enough to feel the warmth. You don't have to tell me, he said. But if you want to, I'm here. Ethan looked at him, at the sincerity in his eyes, and something cracked open inside him. For the first time, he wondered if he could be more than the sum of his masks. The weeks that followed felt like a tightrope walk. Ethan found himself counting the hours until he could see Julian again, their meetings becoming the only moments when he didn't feel like he was performing. But every text from his parents, Diane's overly cheerful check-ins, Greg's curt demands, reminded him how fragile his world was. Ethan met Julian again at a small coffee shop in Fremont, its walls plastered with local art and mismatched furniture. The air smelled of espresso and rain, a quintessentially Seattle afternoon. Julian was already there, sprawled in a corner booth, scrolling through photos on his camera. He looked up as Ethan approached, his smile cutting through the gray of Ethan's mood. Got something for you, Julian said, sliding a small print across the table. It was a photo from their park meeting. A candid of Ethan sketching, his brow furrowed, the lake glinting behind him. The image was soft, almost tender, like Julian had seen something Ethan didn't know was there. You make me look better than I am, Ethan said, half laughing, half embarrassed. Nah, Julian replied, leaning forward. I just show what's already there. Ethan's heart did a strange flip, but he pushed it down. He wasn't ready to name the warmth spreading through him. Not when his life felt like a house of cards. They talked for hours about Julian's dream to exhibit his work, Ethan's fear of showing his sketches to anyone but Julian, the way their families seemed to love them conditionally. Julian's parents, devout Catholics from Yakima, had accepted his queerness with tight-lipped resignation, but their disappointment lingered in every conversation. Ethan felt a pang of envy. Julian's parents were still together, still a unit, even if it was strained. My mom thinks I'm confused, Ethan admitted, stirring his coffee. My dad thinks I'm broken. They split up because of me, but neither of them will say it. Julian's eyes softened. That's not on you, Ethan. They made their choices. You just told the truth. Ethan wanted to believe him, but the guilt was a stone in his chest. He changed the subject, asking about Julian's latest project, a series of photos capturing strangers' moments of joy. Julian's passion was infectious, and by the time they left the shop, Ethan felt lighter, like he could breathe a little deeper. They started meeting regularly, parks, galleries, late-night diners. Julian taught Ethan how to see light like a photographer, pointing out the way shadows danced on brick walls, or how a stranger's laugh could shift the mood of a room. Ethan showed Julian more of his sketches, each one a little braver, a little more honest. One evening, at a quiet pier in Ballard, Julian took Ethan's hand as they watched the ferries glide across Puget Sound. The touch was electric, and Ethan didn't pull away. But the masks were never far off. At his mom's condo, Diane asked probing questions about his new friend, her tone laced with hope that Julian was just a phase. At his dad's, Greg barely spoke, but his silences were loud, each one a reminder of the son he'd wanted Ethan to be. Ethan learned to compartmentalize. Capitol Hill Ethan was open, artistic, hopeful. Puyallup Ethan was quiet, obedient, invisible. Neither was whole. One night, Julian invited Ethan to a small art show in Pioneer Square, where a few of Julian's photos were on display. The gallery was crowded, the air thick with wine and pretension, but Julian's work stood out. Raw, vivid, human. Ethan lingered in front of a photo of a young woman laughing in the rain, her joy so palpable it hurt. He wondered if he'd ever feel that free. "You could show your stuff here someday," Julian said, appearing beside him. "Your sketches are just as good." Ethan shook his head. "No one wants to see my mess." "I do," Julian said, his voice low. He stepped closer, their shoulders brushing, and Ethan's breath caught. For a moment, the gallery faded, and it was just them, the air charged with something unspoken. But then Ethan's phone rang. It was Greg, his voice rough. "You're late. Where the hell are you?" Ethan's stomach dropped. "I'm in Seattle, at an art thing." Greg grunted. "Get home. Now." The call ended, and Ethan felt the walls closing in. Julian touched his arm, concern in his eyes. "You okay?" "I have to go," Ethan said, the words heavy. He wanted to stay, to tell Julian everything, but Puyallup Ethan was already taking over. Julian nodded, but his expression was tight. "Text me when you're home. Okay?" Ethan promised he would, but as he drove south, the weight of his father's disapproval pressed harder. He was tired of splitting himself in two, but he didn't know how to stop. Greg was waiting in the living room, a beer in hand, the TV blaring a football game he wasn't watching. The house smelled of stale smoke and neglect, a far cry from Diane's pristine condo. Ethan dropped his keys on the counter, bracing himself. "You're late," Greg said, not looking up. "Said you'd be here by 9. "I got caught up," Ethan said, his voice small. "The art show." "Art show?" Greg scoffed, finally meeting his eyes. "That what you're doing now? Hanging out with those types?" Ethan's chest tightened. Those types was Greg's code for anyone who didn't fit his narrow view of normal. "They're just people, Dad. Friends." Greg took a long swig of his beer. "You used to be honest with me, Ethan. Now you're sneaking around, acting like someone you're not." The irony stung. Ethan was the one pretending, but not in the way Greg thought. He wanted to scream that he was gay, that he was falling for Julian, that he was tired of being the son Greg wanted. But the words stayed lodged in his throat, and he just nodded, retreating to his room. He texted Julian home, "Sorry for bailing." Julian's reply was quick, "You're good. Talk tomorrow?" Ethan stared at the message, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. He wanted to say more, to tell Julian how much he meant, but fear stopped him. The next week was a whirlwind. Julian invited Ethan to a photography workshop at his university, and for a few hours Ethan forgot his fractured life. They laughed, experimented with lenses, and stole glances that felt like secrets. Julian's confidence, his unapologetic way of existing, made Ethan want to be braver. But every time he got close, his parents' voices echoed, pulling him back. One evening, They ended up at Julian's tiny apartment in the U District, a cluttered space filled with prints and camera gear. Julian was editing photos, his focus intense, and Ethan sketched him from across the room, capturing the curve of his jaw, the way his eyes lit up. When Julian caught him, he grinned. "You're gonna make me famous." Ethan laughed, but it faded fast. "I wish I could be like you. You're so sure of yourself." Julian set his laptop aside, his expression serious. "I'm not, Ethan. I just decided I'm done hiding. My parents don't get it, but I can't live for them. Neither can you." Ethan's throat burned. "It's not that easy. My parents split because of me. If I just kept quiet." "Stop," Julian said, moving closer. "You didn't break them. They broke themselves. You deserve to be you." Julian's hand found his, and Ethan's heart raced. He wanted to lean in, to close the distance, but his phone buzzed. Diane this time, asking when he'd be back at her place. The moment shattered, and Ethan pulled away, mumbling an excuse. Julian's face fell, but he didn't push. "You can't keep running, Ethan. Not from them and not from this." Ethan left, the weight of Julian's words heavy on his shoulders. Back at Diane's, she was waiting with dinner and a forced smile. "You've been out a lot," she said, her tone too casual. "This Julian, he's just a friend, right?" Ethan's stomach twisted. "Yeah," he lied, the mask slipping back on. But as he lay in bed that night, Julian's words echoed. "You deserve to be you." For the first time, he wondered if he could. Ethan's life felt like a tug-of-war, with Julian on one side and his parents on the other. Every moment with Julian was a glimpse of freedom, but every return to his parents' homes was a reminder of the cost. He was running out of strength to keep the masks in place. The turning point came in early November, during a rare weekend when Ethan stayed in Seattle. Julian had convinced him to join a group of art students for a night out in Belltown. The bar was loud, packed with 20-somethings and neon lights, but Julian's presence grounded him. They danced, awkward at first, then freer, their laughter drowning out the noise. When Julian pulled him close during a slow song, Ethan didn't pull away. Their foreheads touched, and for a moment, Ethan felt whole. Later, they ended up on a rooftop overlooking the city, the air sharp with winter's approach. Julian's hand was warm in his, and Ethan's heart pounded. Not from fear, but from something new, something alive. "I like you, Ethan," Julian said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "I don't know what this is, but I want it. Do you?" Ethan froze, the weight of the question crashing into him. He thought of his parents, of the divorce, of the masks he wore to keep them from breaking further. But Julian's gaze was unwavering, and Ethan realized he was tired of running. "Yeah," he whispered. "I do." Julian's smile was radiant, and when he leaned in, Ethan met him halfway. The kiss was soft, tentative, then deepening, a promise of something real. For the first time, Ethan felt like he was exactly where he belonged. But reality wasn't far behind. The next morning, Ethan woke to a missed call from Greg and a text from Diane. "We need to talk." His stomach sank. He'd been dodging their questions about his time in Seattle, but he couldn't avoid them forever. He went to Diane's first. She was in the kitchen, her hands busy with dishes, but her eyes were sharp. "You're different lately," she said. "This Julian, he's more than a friend. Isn't he?" Ethan's heart raced, but Julian's words echoed. "You deserve to be you." "Yeah," he said, his voice shaking. "He's my boyfriend." Diane's face froze, then softened into something like resignation. I just want you to be happy, Ethan. But be careful. This world isn't always kind. The conversation with Greg was worse. He showed up at the ranch house, and Greg was already halfway through a six-pack. Your mom called, he said, his voice low. Said you've got a boyfriend. Ethan braced himself. Yeah. His name's Julian. Greg's jaw tightened. You're throwing your life away, Ethan. You think this is who you are? You're confused. And this kid's making it worse. I'm not confused, Ethan said, his voice rising. This is me. I'm gay, Dad. I've always been. Greg slammed his beer down, the sound echoing. You're not my son if you choose this. The words cut deeper than Ethan expected, but he stood his ground. I'm not choosing anything. I'm just me. He left before Greg could respond, his hands shaking as he drove back to Seattle. Julian was waiting at the park where they'd first met, and when Ethan told him what happened, Julian pulled him into a hug. You did it, he said. You told the truth. Ethan buried his face in Julian's shoulder, the weight of his father's words still heavy but no longer crushing. For the first time, he felt like he might survive this. Ethan's world didn't heal overnight, but the cracks began to feel less like fractures and more like spaces where light could seep through. Julian was his anchor, but Ethan knew he had to find himself beyond the masks he'd worn for so long. The journey was messy, painful, and beautiful. The months that followed were a blur of small victories and lingering wounds. Ethan started spending more time in Seattle, crashing at Julian's apartment when he needed space from his parents. Diane tried harder, inviting Julian over for dinner, her awkward attempts at acceptance a step toward something better. Greg, though, remained distant, his calls rare and strained. Ethan grieved the father he'd lost but refused to let it define him. He threw himself into his art, filling sketchbooks with portraits of Julian, of Seattle's streets, of the person he was becoming. Julian's photography flourished too, and they began collaborating, blending Ethan's sketches with Julian's photos in a project they called Unseen. It was about the parts of people that hid in plain sight, their fears, their hopes, their truths. One spring evening, they presented their work at a small gallery in Capitol Hill. The room was packed, the air buzzing with nervous energy. Ethan's sketches hung alongside Julian's photos, each piece a fragment of their story. The centerpiece was a photo of Ethan, his face half in shadow, half in light, with a sketch of Julian's hand reaching toward him. The caption read, "To be seen is to be free." As the night wound down, Ethan stood with Julian on the gallery's balcony, the city sprawling below. "I was scared I'd never get here," Ethan said, his voice soft. "I thought I'd always be stuck, pretending." Julian squeezed his hand. "You're not pretending anymore. You're you." Ethan smiled, the weight of his past still there but lighter now. He thought of his parents, of the homes he'd navigated, the masks he'd shed. He wasn't whole yet. Not completely, but he was closer than he'd ever been. The gallery owner approached, offering them a spot in a larger show next month. Ethan glanced at Julian, their shared dreams suddenly real. "We're in," he said, his voice steady. As they walked back into the gallery, Ethan caught sight of a familiar figure. Diane, standing by their centerpiece, her eyes misty. She met his gaze and smiled, a real one this time. Greg wasn't there, and maybe he never would be, but Ethan felt a quiet strength in that moment. He had Julian, his art, and a truth he'd fought for. The masks were gone, or at least fading. For the first time, Ethan felt like he was living as himself. Not a son, not a shadow, but a person with a story worth telling.